After October 7th, 2023, I watched something strange happen in Greece where I live. Within days, streets in Greek cities were plastered with genocide graffiti. A kosher restaurant in Athens was vandalized. Walls and tables sprayed black, pamphlets dropped on the floor. The slogan, "No Zionist is safe here," left behind. And when I posted a video in which I condemned these reactions and defended Israel's right to exist, a Greek friend asked me to stop, allegedly because I didn't know what I was talking about. What was extraordinary was not the anger, was produced anger, but this reaction arrived too fast and too specific to be improvised. It was a script that already existed. It just needed a trigger. And the script is always the same. Wars that kill far more people, the Congo, Yemen, Sudan, barely register. But the moment Israel is involved, the most extreme possible framing arrives immediately. Genocide, apartheid, colonial project. Not as a conclusion someone has reasoned their way toward, as reflex. Why? That is what this episode is about. Let me show you what made the reaction look different from normal war protest. 3 things. First, the timing. To understand why the timing matters, you need to know what had just happened. Hamas massacred over 1,200 civilians in southern Israel at a music festival in their homes and took 251 hostages. On purpose. The protests that followed were not a reaction to Israeli military action. Israel hadn't even fired a shot yet. The script was already there before the response existed. On October 8th, the very next day, thousands of people gathered in Times Square to march in support of Palestinian resistance. Not to mourn the dead, not to call for the hostages' release, to celebrate. In any other context, the people in that crowd, many of whom describe themselves as feminists, anti-racist, and human rights advocates, would have been first to condemn a massacre of civilians. Second, the silence where there should have been noise. That same week, UN Women, the global body for gender equality, went silent for weeks on the mass sexual violence committed by Hamas on October 7th. The organization that exists to condemn violence against women could not bring itself to name the often deadly rapes that had been recorded on video. Group loyalty beat principle. Third, the collective responsibility applied to Jews that we apply to nobody else. In liberal societies, we do not hold individuals morally responsible for the actions of a state they do not control. We do not demand that every Syrian abroad answer for Assad, every Iranian abroad answer for the regime's massacres, or every Saudi abroad publicly confess guilt for Yemen before being allowed into polite society. But with Jews in Israel, that kind of collective moral demand became strangely normal. Jewish students harassed on campuses and pressured to personally denounce Israel as a condition of belonging. Synagogues vandalized in cities with no connection to Gaza. And there was nothing like the same scale, energy, or cultural prestige behind demands aimed at Hamas, Hezbollah, or Iran. That asymmetry needs explaining, because it is not new, and it did not emerge spontaneously. The accusations against Jews keep changing their content, but they keep having the same structural shape. A small, distinct, often successful minority, accused not merely of wrongdoing, but of being uniquely evil, with a special danger towards the innocent. In medieval Europe, poisoning wells, killing Christian children in rituals. In 19th and early 20th century Europe, peaking under Nazism, the hidden hand controlling banks, media, governments. And today, in the language of human rights, colonial power, apartheid state, genocidal project. The words change, the pattern doesn't. And here's what makes the current version particularly hard to confront. Nobody today would admit to anti-Semitism, even to themselves. Anti-Zionism gives them a way out. It sounds like a political position rather than a prejudice. But in practice, anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism. It singles out Jewish settlement as uniquely illegitimate while ignoring every other territorial dispute on earth. That is not a principle. That is a target. And it is the same target as always. So why does it keep finding new hosts? Why do people who could be horrified to be called anti-Semitic end up reproducing this pattern? The answer is a mental model that has become dominant among so-called progressives. though in fact they aren't progressive in any meaningful sense of that word. The model is this: all human conflict is fundamentally a power struggle between oppressors and the oppressed. The stronger side is morally suspect. The weaker side deserves unconditional solidarity as a group, regardless of what that group actually does. Apply to this conflict. Palestinians are stateless, under siege, and often framed as less powerful than Israel. And in military and economic terms, Israel is stronger. But that framing also hides something important. Israel is a tiny state in a hostile region, and Jews are a tiny demographic minority in the Middle East. So the moral picture is not nearly as simple as the strong versus the weak. But by this logic, any militant action by the weak is automatically resistance. Palestinian violence becomes resistance. Israeli self-defense becomes colonial brutality. The word genocide feels emotionally correct, even when it is legally wrong, because the oppressor-oppressed map preloaded the conclusion before anyone checked the evidence. This is why the feminists who carried Intifada signs on International Women's Day 2024 were not being hypocrites in their own minds. The framework had already told them which side was the oppressed group. Once that was decided, the actual values of the group, the mandatory hijab, the execution of gay men, the punishment of female autonomy, became secondary. You defend the group, not the values. Hamas disappeared from the analysis entirely. This framework has many names: group first thinking, tribalism, collectivism. The point is the group comes first. And if you look at which political systems have produced mass killings throughout history, the pattern is consistent. The worst outcomes come from movements that place the group above the individual. Communism, socialism, Nazism, Maoism, Islamist theocracies. They look different on the surface, but share a core. The group narrative is sacred. The individual is expendable. Dissent becomes betrayal. Identity politics sits in the same tradition, and it has the same fatal flaw: no built-in error correction. If someone from the oppressed group does something wrong, the framework absorbs it as either justified resistance or a provocation by the oppressor. It is also worth being precise about what this movement is and is not. It does not actually have a track record of supporting minorities. Historically, collectivist movements of this type have always been mass movements, organized around large, numerically powerful groups: the working class, the global south, the oppressed peoples of the world. They adopt certain minorities instrumentally when those minorities serve an anti-Western or anti-liberal narrative. When they don't, the solidarity vanishes instantly. The same networks that mobilize for Palestinian rights have almost nothing to say about the Uyghurs in Chinese detention camps, or Iranians killed by their own governments in the streets, or women in Gaza who live under a government that does not recognize their basic rights. The selection is not principled, it is strategic. And the strategy is always the same: oppose the West, oppose liberalism, oppose Israel. The greatest critics of Israel are applying the vocabulary of liberation to movements that would imprison or kill them for who they are. They can't see it because the framework has already told them which side is oppressed. And once that's decided, everything else follows automatically. So the psychological mechanism is clear. The oppressor-oppressed framework runs on its own. No anti-Semitism required. But that raises the question: this framework could have pointed anywhere. Why did it point so consistently, so intensely, so automatically at Israel? Susceptibility alone doesn't explain the target. For that, you need a trigger, and that trigger was deliberate. The asymmetric framing of Israel as a uniquely illegitimate state was not invented by so-called progressive students on Western campuses. It was invented by the Soviet Union, adopted by Iran, and amplified by virtually every authoritarian regime that needed a wedge issue against the West. You may be hearing this for the first time, most people are, so let me explain exactly how it happened. When Israel was founded in 1948, the Soviet Union was actually one of its first supporters. They voted for its creation at the UN and were the first country to grant it full diplomatic recognition. They expected it to become a socialist state aligned with Moscow. When Israel instead aligned with the United States after the 1967 Six-Day War, the Soviets flipped entirely. They launched a systematic propaganda campaign, run through the KGB, the Communist Party, and Soviet-allied media worldwide to rebrand Zionism as racism, colonialism, and fascism. But here's what made this strategy so powerful. They weren't starting from scratch. The Soviets didn't invent anti-Semitism. What they did was take an ancient hatred and give it a modern, politically acceptable costume, replacing Jews control the banks with Zionists are colonial oppressors, and pushing it through international institutions until it became mainstream. They didn't create the feeling, they industrialized it. They were plugging a Cold War political strategy into a psychological template that had been priming populations for centuries. In fact, the template already had a name and a history. In 1903, a text called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was published in Tsarist Russia. It was fabricated, as historians have clearly proven, by the Tsar's own secret police. It claimed to be minutes of a secret Jewish council plotting to dominate the world. It was a complete forgery, exposed as such by courts, governments, journalists throughout the 20th century. But it was used to incite deadly pogroms against Jewish communities in the Russian Empire, later adopted by Hitler and taught in Nazi schools, and the Hamas founding charter is saturated with its themes. Critically, the protocols were explicitly triggered by the emerging Zionist movement, which means anti-Zionism was built on a conspiracy theory from the very beginning. The Soviet propaganda operation did not have to invent a framework. It was already field-tested. What the Soviets did was update the packaging. The goal was purely strategic: weaken American influence in the Middle East by delegitimizing America's most visible ally there. In 1975, that campaign achieved its biggest victory. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution declaring that Zionism is a form of racism. It was repealed 16 years later, but by then the language had already spread into universities, NGOs, and media across the world. From a different direction, Khomeini's Iran arrived at the same destination. After the 1979 revolution, the first foreign leader invited to Tehran was Yasser Arafat. The keys to the Israeli embassy were handed to the PLO on the spot. Khomeini used anti-Zionism as a tool to unite the Muslim world under Iranian leadership, framing resistance to Israel as resistance to Western imperialism. Hamas, founded in 1987 and funded by Iran, built its founding charter on explicit calls for the elimination of Jews. North Korea, China, Cuba, Venezuela, the pattern repeats. Wherever you find an authoritarian state that defines itself against the Western liberal order, you find the same framing. Israel as the uniquely evil colonial project, criticism of Israel as a marker of moral seriousness. The goal was never justice for Palestinians. In fact, as I've shown in another video, there was and is remarkable indifference for Palestinians among Arab neighbors. The goal was to attach the worst available accusation to the West's most visible democratic ally, and to make supporting that ally politically toxic. That strategy worked beyond anything its architects could have imagined, because it had two engines, not one. The oppressor-oppressed framework primed people to receive it, and the ancient script of anti-Semitism gave it emotional force. Together they created something almost impossible to argue with, a conclusion that feels morally obvious, historically grounded, and politically urgent, and that was designed from the start to feel exactly that way. Today it is reproduced in good faith by millions of people who have never heard of its origins and would be horrified to learn them. People who think of themselves as on the right side of history, who march for human rights, who oppose authoritarianism, who pride themselves on critical thinking, are, without knowing it, doing the authoritarians' work for them. The so-called progressive framing did not make this less likely, it made it more likely. I'm not arguing that Israel is beyond criticism. I'm arguing that the specific, asymmetric, historically patterned certainty we have seen, the instant reach for genocide, the collective responsibility demanded of Jews worldwide, the total disappearance of Hamas from the moral calculus, is not just political disagreement. It is an anti-Semitic pattern written by authoritarian movements in the language of human rights. And like a lot of authoritarian propaganda, it works through projection. Movements with openly genocidal or eliminationist aims accuse their liberal opponents of genocide. Movements that crush dissent speak in the language of liberation. People who have no interest in minority rights suddenly invoke minority rights only when the accusation can be aimed at Israel. Spread through a psychological framework that shuts down critical thinking before it starts. And reproduced today by people who believe they're doing the opposite. A simple test to see where you stand. Ask yourself, if Hamas or Hezbollah won, what would that world look like? Who would have rights? Who would be silenced? Who would be killed? And would you like to live there? That question should be easy to answer. If it isn't, if you find yourself hesitating, that hesitation is worth sitting with, because it means the script is already working on you.